Hi guys, this is another video in my sort of fundamental, sort of basics of painting series. In this one, I'm going to be covering for you my kind of technique for kind of blending, layering paint. It's just the style that I developed. It's what I use basically to paint all of my figures. And I've had a lot of questions from people about exactly how I do it. I mean, you can see me doing it in basically every video that I've made so far, but because the videos are sped up and I sort of shorten segments quite a bit, it can be really difficult to really see my exact brushwork and the exact technique that I am using to paint my figures. So in this film, I'm going to keep it really short. This is not about painting a specific figure, by the way, so I'm not even going to talk about that, but I'm going to show you an example sort of in real time of how I go about sort of creating sort of a blended, layered effect on a specific area, and I'm going to really go into detail talking about that, so hopefully then you get sort of a better sense of exactly what I'm doing with my brush, exactly how I'm holding it, exactly how I'm applying the paint and moving it around. So obviously you want to start out by base coating your figure, and I've sped that up here just because it's pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. You shouldn't really need any instruction with this. The area I'm going to be doing for this tutorial are some pants on a World War II German soldier, because that seems to be something a lot of people are going to be curious about. I am using here a extra dark green from Vallejo as the sort of shadow color on the pants. Okay, so I am going to start out this process here. You can see behind me I've got that shade color I used, a swatch of it out, and I have also got sort of the medium color shade that I want on these pants right next to it, which is German Field Gray World War II. So that's going to be kind of average color that these pants you're going to sort of portray on the pants. That's sort of the base color. Think of it like that. Now, we want to get to that base color with our layering and blending, but we may not want to go right from the shade color up to that because it's going to be just too big of a jump and it's going to make our life a lot harder. So what we're going to do is we're going to make an intermediate shade, and that's what you can see down below there. And what you're aiming for here is to create a color that's sort of halfway tonally between the darker color and sort of that medium color. And this is not necessarily going to be a 50-50 mix of paint. It's going to vary a lot on how dark the one color is, how light the color is. You need to just do this visually, mix the two colors together to try to get a good visual medium, basically. And you want to thin your paint down then so it's got a nice milky consistency. It should be thicker than water, it should resist some, but it needs to be definitely thinner than when it comes out of the bottle. And at this point, when you're applying the color, you don't have to worry so much about blending a lot because the difference between this and the base color is quite subtle, so there's not going to be any real stark areas we're going to have to worry about making sure the colors, go together. So I'm just going to be applying this color to everywhere that I know I want to be at least that bright. And in this case here, that's going to be nearly everywhere on this figure, with the exception of some really sort of deep creases on the pants. Once we've got that sort of intermediate color on, we can move on to applying sort of our medium tone in this whole process, the German Field Gray World War II. Once again, you're going to see you're going to want to thin it down nicely. You want to get that milky consistency, a little bit more viscous than just water. Water consistency is going to be too thin. The paint is not going to have any pigmentation. You don't want that. You need to keep it thick. So there should be some viscosity, some resistance when you're mixing it with your brush, but it needs to move and flow easily. And after you've mixed this, you can see I do it very messily with my brushes because my brush is pretty dirty. Don't leave your brush like that. As soon as you've mixed the paint to the right consistency, immediately clean it off so you don't mess up your bristles. Okay, and now we're going to start applying the paint. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm putting it very lightly onto the tip of my brush only, and you can see I'm even wiping it off a little bit because I don't want too much paint buildup on there. And you can see now I go right in onto the pants. And what you're going to do is, as before, you should always start applying the paint on an area you know that you want to be at least as bright as whatever color of paint you're using. So on the pants, that's always going to be sort of on the tops of creases and folds and anywhere light's hitting, you know, that kind of thing. This is still the medium color, so you're still going to probably want to apply it in quite a few areas. But you can see I'm always starting in an area that I know is going to be really bright and really saturated with that particular color. And then you can see how I apply it, and then I'm going to pull it out from that point that I know I want that bright. On areas like with those creases, it's going to be easier because you've got a sharp crease that's immediately dark and next to light, and you don't have to worry too much about blending. The blending and smoothing is going to come in on those legs where you've got sort of soft, gentler, more undulating surfaces, and, you know, these sort of like knees and things like that, and softer creases in the case of these pants. Now, the layer I've applied at this point, this paint is somewhat thinned down, so it's a bit transparent. So it's going to be going onto the pants here in such a way that it's not going to, what you see going onto the pants, it's not going to be immediately as saturated as that paint you see down on my work table. It's a little bit darker, you can see through. That's good. This is part of the whole layering process that you're doing here. You want the first pass that you're going to be making on the pants with this color. It shouldn't be as saturated as that paint. You want that transparency, and again, you can keep the transparency even lower by making sure you just don't put very much paint on the brush, but you don't load it very much. And again, here you can see on these sharp creases, I'm doing the same thing. I'm applying the paint, just getting a teeny tiny bit on my brush, and then starting on areas that I know I want to be bright and pulling it out from there. And you may ask, how is it, you know, that I go about, you know, pulling the paint out, you know, so that looks good? Well, I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more in a second. But first, I just want to point out that once you've made one whole pass around the whole area that you're going to be painting with one color, you're probably going to want to go back and go over it again, because that's what, as I said about the paint being somewhat transparent, it's not going to reach its full saturation with one pass. So now you're going to continue back over all those areas and brighten the ones further, can add another layer of the same color to brighten or lighten those areas up further. And this is nice because you're doing this with you're still only using one color here, but you're just making multiple passes and applying it thinly. So now, so I'm going back over those same areas again with the same color, and you can see that's adding more saturation and more depth of that color to the areas that I picked out. And each pass you're going to be applying successively less of the color that you've got. And one thing to keep in mind here is that the paint almost always will dry sort of more subtle. It'll be less bright and stark usually after it's had a chance to dry. Right after you apply it, it's often be brighter and lighter than it looks a little bit while later. So that's why it's important to sort of make one pass around the figure, and that gives a chance for the point where you start to kind of dry down a little bit and give you a more accurate reading of how that color is really going to look on the figure, and that'll help you then estimate better where you need to continue adding paint and continue lightening up the fabric. And now I'm going to start making a highlight, or a first highlight tone for the pants, and I'm going to use as a base for that German field gray World War II again, and I'm going to be lightening it. I'm using Vallejo Dark Sand as my lightening color. You can see I've swatched it there, and when you're lightening almost any dark color like this, a yellowy sand or a cream color is always a good bet. But we don't want to approach this the way we did before when we were creating a mid-tone between our shade and our medium color. You don't really want to go halfway between the two, because you don't want the pants, your highest color on the pants is not going to be that yellow. So what you really need to just be doing here is you want to be lightening the base shade a bit. So what we're aiming for here is a color that's distinctly lighter in the mid-tone, but the step you're making should not be too extreme, because it's just going to create more work for you when you're blending. You're going to have a harder time. So it's not to say you can't make it way lighter, but you need to do it graduations. The bigger a step, just a rule of thumb with it in general, the bigger of a step you make between any two colors, the harder the blending and application is going to be. It's going to be always going to be possible, but you're going to have to be spending a lot more time working over the figure, and it's just going to get harder. So breaking it down into reasonable chunks is a good idea. And once again, I thin the paint here to a good consistency. It's sort of viscous milk, and once I'm pretty happy with that, I'm going to start applying it to the figure. And now I'm really going to be talking a little bit more about my blending technique for you, because the contrast between this and my last shade is bigger. So, and whenever that happens, the blending gets to be more of an important aspect here. So like before, I'm going to be applying the paint to an area that I know I want to be at least that bright as the paint, and it is thinned down, so remember, one layer of it is not going to automatically be as bright as what you see on the palette. It's going to take a couple layers to achieve that. But what I do here is I apply the paint, and as soon where I want it the brightest, and I'm still not putting much paint on my brush, so the application is small to begin with, but I'm putting it there, and you can see I apply the paint there to an area where I want it bright, and now I'm going to be taking my brush here, and I'm going to immediately be getting excess paint off the brush as soon as I apply it. Instantly, you need to get that paint off, but you need to keep your brush damp, not wet, so you shouldn't be dipping it right into your water can. That will get your brush too wet, and that won't work. It needs to be moist, but not covered in paint. There's different ways you can achieve this. I personally use my tongue to do this. That may sound gross, unsanitary. If it bothers you, I can understand, don't do it. But I find that a quick and effective way to get my brush just the right level of dampness without having any paint on the bristles. However, if you don't want to do this, you could use a damp paper towel, kind of a damp moistened sponge, something like that. So something that'll get your paint off but still not dry the brush out entirely. So as soon as I have got the paint down, I immediately go get that excess paint off of the brush so it's still damp. And I'm doing this very quickly before the paint that I've just applied is really dry, and so it's kind of going to be viscous and move around on the surface. So I apply it, I get the excess paint off the brush, and then I go right back in and I start moving it out from that point where I just applied it. So I'm then so you can see there, I apply the paint, and you can see I'm taking a lot of very fine, light, very gentle strokes and sort of just pulling it out away from that brightest point that I started from. And if you've got folds or creases, you want to kind of work along the fold, but you should sort of just work back from the brightest area, gently pulling the paint out so that it gets gradually lighter and lighter and lighter as you move away from that sort of starting position on the figure. When you've got really sharp creases like in these pants, as I said, it's a lot easier because you don't really have to worry about too much. You can just put that paint down and just kind of leave it. There's not much need for blending. The blending only comes in when you've got soft creases and more just softer feeling areas on the figure. And with this, you can see that there's a lot of area on this figure that's really going to be hidden in shadows, under his legs. And in this case, he's got that big old, that big AT weapon he's carrying, and that's going to create a lot of shadow, in this case, on the fronts of his legs, so they're not going to need very much highlighting. So most of the focus is going to be anywhere where there's not an obvious big object casting shadows. And knees are always a place you want to emphasize normally. In this case, less so, but if anywhere the knees are exposed, you're going to want to be doing this kind of thing. I think I've talked about that quite a bit before, but again, here I'm putting the color here on the highest part of the crease and then pulling it outwards, and as I pull it outwards, the paint is going to get increasingly thinner and more transparent and less dense and concentrated as I pull it away from that central point where I applied it. And you're also going to be noticing that in some cases, once I've finished applying the paint and blending it outwards, I'm still going to have some paint that's left in my brush that I picked up in that blending process. And you can make good use of that as well, because you can then kind of apply that to areas where you want to get a very slight, very transparent highlight, but you don't want it to even be as strong as the area that you were sort of originally blending out from. So that's kind of like, that's going to be kind of a secondary use for, you know, the color once it's kind of on your brush, basically. So now I want to kind of put on what I'm sort of planning to be my final major highlight on this figure. And you can start a whole new color here, but usually what I find is easier, especially when you're adding successive highlights, is to just take the highlight shade that you already made and just lighten it further with whatever lightening color you're using. So in this case, the dark sand. So I'm just going to be mixing even more dark sand in there and getting a color that's even lighter, more yellowish. We're getting really kind of a avocado green here, I guess. And remember that the paint on the palette that you had is probably going to have dried a bit, got a little thicker, plus you're mixing in more thick paint that hasn't been thinned into it, so you're going to have to probably add more water, adjust the thickness so that you can maintain that nice viscosity that we've been saying is really important when you're doing this. And again, remember, this color looks quite light, but we're going to be applying it thinly. And as a matter of fact, when you're highlighting a very dark color like this with a relatively light color, even though we've done it in layers, once you get to the higher sort of stages of the highlight, it's a good idea to probably thin the paint a little bit more than you would strictly have to at the sort of darker highlight levels, because it'll be more transparent, it'll look better. And it looks, another thing, it's going to look really bright on your palette you're working from, because that's white and the paint is really concentrated, and over this, of course, over this darker surface we've got on the pans, it's going to kind of give you a different effect. But you can see by this point, I'm really only focusing the color now on some very selective areas. Now you can see I'm not even bothering at this point to even try to paint the areas under the legs, or kind of where there's a lot of shadow being cast here by the Panzer Schreck. You don't even want to bother with those lighter colors there at this point. I'm putting a lot of attention on the knee, because that area is typically going to be always kind of get hit by a lot of light often, because it sticks out, and it also tends to get worn and faded when you're talking about fabric in that area. It takes a lot of wear, so you can always feel pretty comfortable about highlighting a lot. And as I've said before, I often make multiple passes with a color. When you get to this high a highlight, it's this extreme, you may not want, as a matter of fact, you probably won't want to be making multiple passes, because you actually don't want to get the color that extreme and that bright. So you may only really need one layer of these brighter colors to get as much highlight as you need. And also remember, if you have some more subtle, soft creases on your pans, you probably won't want to start really picking them out or distinguishing them before you get to this phase, because you don't want them to look really sharp and extreme when they're not sharp and extreme. So you probably shouldn't actually try to define them with their own sort of color value until you get to this really high extreme highlight stage, and then you're going to want to kind of pick them out maybe a little bit. So they're going to be it's going to have an overall light area, and then you're going to make those really soft creases just even ever so slightly lighter with just some really light application and a little bit of, you know, of judicious blending where necessary. Now, I said before that was basically what I did before was kind of my highest highlight, but remember, when you're painting this, you always have to be constantly looking at work, evaluating how it looks, if it's the way you want. And as I said, colors really change a lot when you're doing this after the paint has fully dried. So you may say, well, maybe I want it a little bit lighter after all, and that's what I'm doing here. I've decided that there's just a few areas I want to touch with an even lighter highlight, so I made a mixture with even more of the bone color sort of to lighten it up. And it's always those same areas now, but this is really where I'm just really going to be really lightly touching just a few very select areas with the color. And again, as I said just before, I'm not going to be making many passes with this. I'm going to be doing it really transparently, keeping the paint really thin, and not really trying to build up this color I've just made, just kind of using it to kind of lighten up some of and further pick out some of those really light areas that I already know I want to be really light, but I want to emphasize and highlight kind of even more than I already had. And there's one other thing I kind of wanted to say at this point, because people are always saying, how do you keep your brush from not getting all smashed when you're doing this? And part of that is having a good quality brush that holds its shape, I always say, but another part of that is just having a light touch. And it's very, very, very important when you're doing this that you develop a really light touch. At any time, you only want to use just the softest, finest, very end of your brush. You need to learn to barely touch the surface. It's like a pencil. You push too hard, the lead's going to get mashed and break. It's kind of the same thing with a brush. So learn to have a light touch, and that's also important because it means you won't be putting down as much paint. You'll be able to get a lighter, more transparent layer of paint down on your brush. It's just really, really important for getting a subtle effect. And it's important when you're blending out the paint, because you see that's a process of making lots of very fine, rapid, light strokes kind of away from the starting point. So just another point of advice, practice using your brush in a way where you really are barely touching the model, and that generally is just going to be a good practice for anything you're doing. And if you do that, it will also give you better brush control. The more you push down on the tip, the harder you're going to find it is to control whatever line you're making. Alright, so here's sort of the finished pair of trousers on the German soldier figure that I picked out. And I hope this gives you kind of a good general sense of how I approach kind of blending and layering when I'm painting really any figure. And this is the same technique I really follow for any color combination on pretty much any area of clothing, except maybe very small, tiny areas. You don't need to do this because there's so little surface to cover. You don't have to worry about it, but pretty much any sizable area, it's going to be the same technique, maybe more or less blending, depending on how sharply and heavily creased it is. And I know this technique is not to everybody's taste. Maybe some people may find it hard, but I hope, at least maybe it'll give you some idea, if you like how I paint, to kind of get a sense of how I do it. So once again, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and leave me comments. Let me know if you like this, if you found it useful, if there were things that you still don't understand, or specific points that you need to have clarified. I'll be happy to do that for you. If you think I need to explain some other things, or there's things I could tell you that would make this more logical. But I hope just playing this for you in real time would be the best way for you to really see what I'm doing. And so finally, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my videos so you can keep up with what I'm doing. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.